Okay, welcome everyone. When you go into breakout groups later, do introduce each other. If you just look down the list of people who are coming, you'll see, I'm sure you'll find people that you're desperate to network or speak to or something like that. So that's, I hope, something that you'll appreciate out of this as well, is maybe knowing other people who are sharing our agenda and who you might be interested, whether or not you agree with the exact things we're talking about today. So that's great. I can say now, just in case I forget the end, I'm extremely grateful to my colleague Catherine, who I work with at Community Renewal Trust, for doing lots of the administration on this and making sure it was all set up, and Lindsay and Peter from Poverty Alliance and Down to Earth. I've said them the wrong way around, but you're going to hear from them in a minute, for agreeing to kind of partner with us on this. Okay, I want to open just by saying hi. I'm John Halliday. I have two hats on. One is I'm the chief executive of the anti-poverty charity Community Renewal Trust, which is the parent charity that owns Caledonia Funeral Aid. I'm the chair of Caledonia Funeral Aid, and I've been involved since it was set up in 2017, but I claim no credit for any of the hard work of my colleagues. I literally just turn up and host some meetings every now and again for it. You'll hear from Emma, who's a funeral director and senior bereavement advisor there, who does a huge amount of work. And also we've got colleagues and volunteers who've made a difference both this year and in the past. So please, I take no credit for any of that. I did want to use the convening basically, and the fact that I'd try to have this zoomed out view on what are the big things that we need to do to try to fight funeral poverty in Scotland and make sure people can afford a dignified funeral that meets their needs in whatever way possible. And this is aspect of talking about funeral support payment is a very small aspect of that in some ways. Poverty is huge. The complex issues around funerals and how we have memorials and the dignity and all those is a huge topic. We're just kind of zooming in on one part because I really think there's some action to do. We're going to record today's session, as you might see. And so if your colleagues who you want to get involved in this, you're welcome to share that later. Catherine will send it around. We're not intending to send this to Scottish Government as our proposal, but by the end of today, hopefully there'll be something where we say, here's some actions we can pursue, and here's some ideas for how we could make change to funeral support payment that we actually think is most vital and important. I'm going to hand over in a second to Emma, who is going to just briefly introduce herself and then talk through some human stories about what she really hears at the front line in terms of funeral poverty and people's stories, particularly around funeral support payment, because it's so important we root this in the human experience of how benefits happen. We often start with statistics and how the world can feel a hostile place at the moment and a little bit hopeless, but actually hearing some human stories helps ground us both in the kind of importance of this, but also maybe some of the opportunities. But I do want to just give permission to everyone to say it's okay to either that we all acknowledge that, we can think that Scottish Government's done a good job, by the way, around funeral support payment. We can feel that things have been going well, or people have taken a lot of positive steps, and also make some criticism. So I'm conscious that today, when you're speaking, even just privately, or we've got presenters, I just want to make sure we've got permission to say it's okay that we can, on the one hand, be really celebratory about some good decisions that have been made and the advances that we've had in the past, without thinking that just because we feel like we're sometimes nitpicking, it can feel like we're saying everything's wrong. We can both be celebrating and be saying more could be done. It's really today about directing what are the most important things that we would get done if we could get some things done, so we can all be on the same page. Okay, that's all right. So Emma, I'm going to hand over to you for about 10 minutes, if that's okay, just to set the scene in terms of some kind of human stories around funeral poverty and the funeral support payment.
So we're all here today with the same sort of common interest, looking at how could we improve funeral support payment? Is it sufficient? Is it available to enough people? Is it applied in the best way? Some of the questions that have sort of come to light recently. So what I'd like to do is maybe to start some of the discussions and get you guys thinking about it all, is to share an insight into its impact it has, if any, or lots or little, in its current format on some of the bereaved people in Scotland, by just sharing some case studies of people who have helped recently. I've changed a few of the details for confidentiality reasons, so it's not all the same names, dates, etc. So Kelly called Caledonia Funeral Aid looking for help, and Kelly's in her 40s and she lives in Glasgow by herself. Her dad took unwell in 2021, and Kelly explained to me her story about how he slowly began to lose some of his skills and abilities, but no one could give a diagnosis. She helped her dad, she moved in with him, became his carer almost, got adaptations made to his house, they had to pay out for a wheelchair and things like that. And eventually she described how he was finally diagnosed in June 2023 with motor neuron disease. But sadly, from the point of diagnosis, he deteriorated so rapidly he actually died within just 8 weeks. Her whole life had been turned upside down, and she wanted to give her dad the funeral she wanted for him. She invited friends and families, and her bill came to around £4,000 for the funeral, which, as we probably all know, is kind of average, really, in the UK. So Kelly was herself in receipt of universal credit. She received about £100 a week, she told me. So she applied for the funeral support payment, and she was awarded the full amount, which for Kelly at that time was around the 1700 mark. This was paid straight to the funeral director, as this was the agreement they had come to for the funeral director to agree to take on Kelly's dad's funeral. This left Kelly with a shortfall of just over £2,000, around 2,200 I think it was. She thought her dad had savings, but when she went to check on this, he actually only had £200 left. Because what had happened between herself, Kelly and her dad, all their savings had been spent on trying to make his life easier over the last couple of years. And as he had got sicker, it had involved costs for a wheelchair, the adaptations and things like I mentioned before. She described how if only he'd got his diagnosis earlier, then he might have got some help through sort of grants, through motor neuron disease charities and things like that. But without a diagnosis, there was no way to get those grants through. So Kelly had called us at this point in her life, as she had nowhere to turn to help her to pay this debt. She only had her universal credit to live off, which, as I mentioned, was around £100 a week, and she was now actually struggling to afford food. She was really emotional on this call, as you can understand. Living off £100 and still trying to make repayments to this debt, Kelly was struggling. She subsequently has struggled to really grieve for her dad, as she feels such a weight of these financial pressures. She is now getting support for her mental health, which has been helpful, and she's still trying slowly to pay back this debt, but it's still weighing heavily on her. Then we have Helen, and she sadly found herself in a very similar situation. So Helen had called us at Caledonia asking for help with funeral debt. Now Helen's story is slightly different. Helen is a single parent, lives at home in Fife, and she relayed how her young son, just in his early 20s, was diagnosed with cancer. He did put up a good fight, he fought it for some time, bless him, before he sadly died at home last year. Now Helen had wanted to have a funeral for her son with all his young friends to attend. She was, though, aware of the cost for everything, and so she tried to keep them to a minimum. Being a single parent, she was used to, she described, managing her money well. She'd had to stop work, though, Helen, to care for her son, because he wanted to be at home, quite rightly so, and she wanted to be with him as much as possible. And to make that happen, she'd had to leave her job. So she'd applied for funeral support payment, and received the full amount, which was around £1,600 for Helen. But this still left her with a bill of just under £2,000 to pay. The funeral director in this case was not quite as sympathetic, unfortunately, and the invoice for her son's funeral arrived the morning after the funeral. Helen resorted to borrowing money from family and friends and anywhere she could get it to pay the funeral director, as she received a final bill again from him less than a week later, and she really couldn't cope with that pressure. Helen's only income is through her job seeker's allowance, so she is really struggling at the moment to cope with daily living costs and also trying to repay her friends who she really doesn't want to let down. Kelly and Helen's examples show how an average funeral, neither of them were extravagant. Their costs were kept sort of to a minimum, as much as they could. That even though they got the full funeral support payment, it still can actually trigger a financial crisis for the bereaved relative. And Kelly's and Helen are not alone in this scenario, where the funeral support payment has made some impact and it has helped, but it's just not been enough to prevent the financial difficulties that have arose since due to the bereavement that they have experienced. So funeral support payment, like for Kelly and Helen, was available to them because they're on eligible benefits. But does it cover everybody that it should? So I had a call from Carol, who is 70. She lives alone in sort of the Stirling area in Scotland. And Carol had called after a long-term partner, Alan, had died after a battle with cancer. Carol didn't actually make this call until 4 weeks after Alan had died, as she was really scared and she didn't know what to do. She just didn't have any money, is how she explained it. She and Alan had no savings. She had worked on and off throughout her life, and Alan had worked, but it was a low wage earner, and there was never any money to put away. So Carol had called Social Security Scotland after Alan's death and to ask to apply for funeral support payment. But as she was not on any of the eligible benefits, she wouldn't have been able to make a successful application, they told her. After this call, Carol panicked. She knew that she didn't have any savings, and she knew that with no funeral support payment, she literally had her income, of which is the state pension, to not only live off, but also to pay for Alan's funeral. Her anxiety over her financial situation has led her to do nothing with regards to funeral planning at all for the whole month, until she called us at Caledonia Funeral for help. Somehow, she says, a person in receipt of only a state pension, which as we know is not really a huge amount of money to live off alone, is now expected on top of that to find the cost of a funeral, which can, as we all know, run into a couple of thousand without too much effort at all. So you can see why Carol, in her circumstance, chose to hide away and not face up to the situation. And Carol's situation is not unique either. There are other bereaved pensioners, and you could perhaps add in students into that who get by on minimal amounts of income for daily costs of living, and they don't receive any benefits. This automatically rules them out of any funeral support payment. So how do people think they're able to find this amount of money? So these are just 3 examples of the many, many examples that I could have shared today, unfortunately. Funeral support payment, in Kelly and Helen's examples, it did make a small impact and it did help towards the cost of a funeral. And in Carol's example, it played no part due to her eligibility. But what the 3 of them all do have in common is that they all live now alone in Scotland. They're now in financial difficulties. They all have debts to pay that they don't have a means to do so, and they only have a minimal income. They all really sadly are suffering from mental health issues as a consequence of potentially their grief and their financial situation. And yet these people, they're only in the very early stages of grieving the loss of the most important person in their lives. So I just pose the question, what can we do? I'd love to be able to look at the ways in which we can try and prevent others having to face these similar experiences, and hopefully we can come up with some good ideas today. That's me.
Thanks so much, Emma. That was fantastic and very moving. We're going to go straight into listening to Lindesay Mace from Down to Earth just now, and I'll let her introduce herself rather than introduce her on your behalf. Lindesay, please go ahead. And I understand you have a presentation you might be sharing on the screen as well. So.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you so much, Emma. That was it. Even though it is so familiar to me because of the work that we do, similar to you, it was still really moving to hear. So, and really important to start this discussion today. So, thank you. Yeah, I'm just going to share my screen to share some slides with you. So hopefully everyone can see. I'm Lindesay Mace. I'm co-manager of Quaker Social Action's Funeral Poverty Project, Down to Earth, and the influencing lead here. For those of you who don't know us, Down to Earth was set up 14 years ago and runs a UK-wide funeral costs helpline, down to earth, where we give advice and guidance to people struggling with funeral costs. We have now supported directly over 7,000 people, and we then use that frontline knowledge to campaign for change and for an end to funeral poverty. So I've sort of got some of the heavy lifting today. I'm going to talk about the history of the funeral support payment. I'll try not to put you to sleep. What it provides, why the Scottish Government has a duty to increase the amount in our view, and what we think they should increase it to. And I look forward to hearing everyone else's thoughts in the discussions afterwards. So I'm going to start with some history. So 1987, a means-tested payment replaced what had previously been the almost universal death grant. The funeral expenses payment covered the UK. It didn't have a cap. It was designed to cover the essential expenses, as they were referred to. So it included cemetery and crematorium fees, funeral director, coffin, transport, a minister, as was specified back then, flowers, and more. Then in 95, the funeral expenses payment was split into two sections, and the items in the essential list were reduced, removing the funeral director and the coffin, for example, and a capped portion of £500 was created that could be used for those things and anything else not in the essentials list. So then we go forwards another 2 years, and yet more items were removed from the essentials list. The minister and the allowance for flowers, for example, leaving the capped portion now £600 to cover most things beyond the cemetery and crematorium fees. This is essentially the structure we have now, with minor differences. So in 2003, the exact funeral expenses payment structure we have now was brought in, with the capped portion now at £700. Now, another 16 years goes by without an increase in the capped portion, taking us to 2019, when the Scottish Government created the funeral support payment. Now, as John alluded to at the beginning, we think they worked really hard to make it reach more people than the original funeral expenses payment, about 40% more, by rewriting the eligibility criteria. As Emma has just indicated, we also believe it could still improve and potentially reach more people, but it is vastly better. However, they stuck to the payment structure and to the £700 amount for other costs, the amount that had been frozen for 16 years. That was their baseline. With one difference, they made that portion a flat rate rather than a capped amount, so that everyone is entitled to it regardless of the size of their bill, though deductions of any money in the deceased person's estate mean not everyone will receive the full amount. So then we go to 2020, and the Scottish Government followed the UK Government in increasing the flat rate to £1,000. And since then, they've uprated it annually with inflation. So that's how we've got to where we are now. So where are we now, and what makes up, how is the funeral support payment made up? So as we just saw, it essentially comprises two sections. One is a fixed list of products and services that will be covered where relevant, as long as the costs are considered reasonable. So in there, the cemetery and crematorium costs will include, say, a new grave or lair, and the interment or the burial itself, or a standard cremation slot, for example. Note that the transport at the bottom there doesn't include the first 80 kilometres, so won't apply to lots of people. Then the second section is the flat rate, set at the moment at £1,178.75, and is intended to be used for everything else. It is this second part, the flat rate, that we believe results in the payment being too low. And you can see this on the next slide. So this graph shows the capped amount of the funeral expenses payment in blue, which, as we know, is what the funeral support payment flat rate was based on. And it shows that against the UK funeral director fees for what Sun Life calls a basic funeral, as gathered by them in their cost of dying report since 2006. And just to say, the products and services included in that basic funeral are collection and care of the deceased, a hearse with attendants or bearers, a funeral director, one limousine following car, use of the chapel of rest, and an oak veneer coffin. So no officiant or flowers, for example. Then the orange and yellow lines show the funeral support payment flat rate set against Sun Life's average funeral director fees for a basic funeral in Scotland specifically. The Scotland funeral director fees, as you'll notice, are only since 2018 because the data only goes back that far, but you can see how they're, sort of broadly similar to the UK average. So while the graph does highlight, you can see at the bottom the slight improvement in the funeral support payment flat rates versus the funeral expenses payment capped amount in the rest of the UK, the difference between the flat rates and the average funeral director fees that it's commonly needed for is still huge. So what has the Scottish Government said recently? So in 2020, Ipsos Mori, I never know how to say that, Ipsos Mori carried out an evaluation of the funeral support payment on behalf of the Scottish Government. And their conclusions highlighted one of the issues for consideration as reviewing the funeral support payment award amounts in relation to the average cost of funerals in Scotland. And the government appeared to accept this in their response, saying that the average cost of a funeral should be monitored and this should be reflected in the fixed rate. They also confirm at the top what we know and what we heard about from Emma and what we see in our work, that many claimants still face taking on debt. And the graph you just saw shows the fixed rate is still far off reflecting the average cost of a funeral. Now, the annual inflationary increases are very welcome, and the government has committed to raising the flat rate by inflation again in April, which will take it to 1,250 by my calculations. But this is still not enough to reflect average funeral costs. So what is the impact of struggling to pay for a funeral? Well, Emma gave you a really good sense of it through Carol, Helen and Kelly's case study. And we've been hearing about it from our clients for over a decade. And so last year we worked with Sun Life to ensure the inclusion of data around this in their Cost of Dying 2024 report that came out this month. It found that across the UK, 1 in 5 families face notable financial concerns paying for a funeral. And of those people, 3 in 4 say it impacted their mental health. And 2 in 3 say paying for a funeral impacted their physical health. Then 3 in 4 say it affected their standard of living, with 1 in 3 having to cut back on essentials like food, which Emma touched on, and 1 in 4 struggling to pay bills or rent. It's worth noting as well that some people who felt they didn't fall into the notable financial concerns category also said their standard of living was impacted, so that actually of all respondents, this was 1 in 4. Now, in our view, this is unacceptable. So what is the Scottish Government's legal duty? Well, under international law, the Scottish Government has a duty to respect, protect and fulfil people's right to an adequate standard of living and the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. That's through a treaty signed by the UK, but that also applies to devolved administrations. In addition to that, the Scottish Government is also in the process of actually incorporating these rights into domestic Scottish law through the Human Rights Bill. But as we've just seen, funeral poverty often denies people these rights because their health is impacted and they have to cut back on food and can't pay their rent. So this is just a very, very brief case study of someone that we helped in Scotland who was claiming the funeral support payment. Nathan had simple cremation for his dad. It cost £3,250. The funeral support payment paid £2,150. So that's 66% of his funeral bill. So that's a big help, but it still left a debt of £1,100. And he reported that the debt hanging over him stopped him sleeping, exacerbated his mental health difficulties, and left him wondering if there was any point in his life. So what is our ask? So it's clear to us that the element that results in many funeral support payment awards being too low is the flat rate portion. So we would like the Scottish Government to increase this further, but the question is to what? Well, there is one final figure to add to this graph. So following the conclusion of the Competition and Markets Authority's investigation into the funeral industry in 2020, they began monitoring funeral director fees. And in their 2023 market review, the average UK funeral director fee for an attended funeral was £2,331. This is what we would like to see the flat rate pay. Although I should say that the next Competition and Markets Authority market review is due in a couple of weeks, so this might change slightly. I thought I'd just explain briefly why we chose to use the CMA figure and not the Sun Life figure. Sorry, Jordan, I know you're on the call. There were a few reasons, but the main two being the CMA is a UK-wide government department, which we feel adds weight. And the Sun Life's basic funeral includes a following car and bearers. The CMA attended funeral doesn't include either. Otherwise, it is essentially the same. Now, we're not saying that it's not okay for people to want to have a following car or bearers. We know they're important to many people, and we recognise that there is no one set of products and services that meets the needs of all cultures, faiths, or beliefs. But we were looking for what might be seen as the most reasonable depiction of a simple funeral. So this is what we are calling for, effectively. The principle of splitting the payment in this way with a portion that can be used how the applicant wants makes sense, but only if that portion pays enough. So I'll just come out of these slides and finish by saying that we recognise that as it's a flat rate, it may mean some people receive more than they spend on products and services traditionally found on a funeral bill, particularly those who have a direct cremation. But firstly, at the most, only 20% of funerals are direct cremations, according to Sun Life. This figure is also debated in the sector, with people pointing to other data that suggests it's perhaps as low as 11% or 12%. Citing confusion around the exact definition of a direct cremation as a possible reason for the difference. Secondly, where people do choose to have a less conventional funeral, such as a direct cremation, we believe they should not be penalised for that decision by receiving less support. There is no one way to mark someone's death. And besides, according to Sun Life, 9 in 10 people who have a direct cremation do have a wake or memorial service, which carries its own costs. And plus, we see people encountering many other unexpected costs connected to a death, costs they are unable to manage on benefits. And if the flat rate isn't increased sufficiently because of the possibility of, we suspect, a small number of applicants getting more than their funeral-related costs, thousands of people will continue to be negatively impacted. So our suggestion is keep it simple, keep it a flat rate to maintain the level playing field that the Scottish Government rightly created. And while we acknowledge we don't have data from Social Security Scotland around this, we think that any unintended gains to applicants would be minimal. The Scottish Government is committed to tackling funeral poverty and it has made great strides, but there is more work to be done. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lindsay. Great analysis as well, and so much detail. I really like that. Next is going to be Peter from the Poverty Alliance talking, and then we're going to have a break and I'll come back and suggest what Caledonia Funeral Aid's been thinking. Kind of part of the point in today's meeting is to say there's a few different ways we could pitch this at different levels. There's a few different things we could emphasize or prioritize. And we kind of want your help to say, of the things Lindsay's talking about, Peter's talking about, myself's talking about, we feel like we're all on the same page really. But it's about like, where do we pitch it in terms of, is there a kind of unified Scottish ask of government? So just listen out for some of those details. It's not the only time you'll hear this, but we'll try not to overwhelm you with too much detail. But next is Peter up, and then we're going to have a break. So thanks very much.
Thanks very much, John. Okay, so let me just share my screen. Firstly, thanks to John and Catherine for organising today's discussion. I think it's, as we've already seen, incredibly important, incredibly insightful contributions we've had already. Hopefully you can all see my screen there. What I want to do, just firstly, Poverty Alliance is a national anti-poverty network in Scotland, and we've been working for over 30 years on a range of anti-poverty issues, but social security is right at the heart of what we do. One of our strategic aims is to ensure that more people have access to adequate levels of support through social security. And I think what we've heard already this morning illustrates one area of our system in Scotland where we're undoubtedly falling down at the moment. So what I want to do is just go through some of the background, I guess. We've heard from Emma and Lindesay, and that have brought real detail and I think really quite troubling detail to this discussion. What I want to do is place it in the wider context of the approach that we've taken to social security in Scotland. And I want to start with why this matters, and it really picks up where partly where Lindesay left off and some of the points that she touched on. One of the things that when we talk to people who are living on low incomes, as I'm sure many people on this call will recognise, is whilst income is really important, and people talk to us about the experience of living on low income all the time, what they most often talk about is dignity, and very often the lack of dignity that people receive. And that is a fundamental human right. That's there in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Dignity is fundamental to the realisation of our rights. And I think, as Lindesay has already said, that's something that we need to frame our discussions about poverty and the links between paying for a funeral and poverty more clearly. We need to frame our discussions about what's needed and why change is needed within that context of rights. So low income and dignity are intimately linked. And I think from the contributions we've heard from Emma and Lindesay already, it is so clear that the inability to provide the kind of send-off for a loved one that we would all want is absolutely a denial of that dignity. So it is a breach of individual human rights, and we should be confident about saying that when we're looking to make change. Now, what I want to talk about now is how we got here, really. So I thought Lindesay's contribution, given us that history of the funeral support payment and how we've got to where we are in Scotland, is interesting, particularly around how we've established the levels. But what I want to do is zoom out a bit and say, well, how does our social security system work? Because it's a bit of a mystery. For many people, when you receive that letter telling you you're receiving universal credit will tell you that the government has determined, but it's not clear how the government has gone about making that determination. So if we go right back to when our modern social security system was set up, following the Beveridge report, really what we were looking to do there, whilst Beveridge was all about addressing want, what the actual design of our system was always about was providing a subsistence income. So the minimum that it was assumed that one needed to get by with what the government could afford. So that's always been the position that governments since the 1940s in the UK have taken. And that's hardwired into our social security system. There have been at least one attempt, perhaps two, in the 1960s, that I'm aware of, where there was an attempt to review what the rates were. Those reviews found that the rates were insufficient, but those reports were never published, and there's been no systematic approach by government since then to assess what people actually need. There's been no attempt to address the inadequate nature of social security provision. Indeed, throughout the 1980s and into the 1990s and beyond, governments have consistently said it's not even possible to identify what people would actually need. And the result of this, I think, is seen in the way that we have our funeral support payment. The result is entitlements that are fragmented about who gets what and when, that they're partial, they don't cover what people actually need, and they're complicated as well. So they're not straightforward to get, so people often miss out on what they're entitled to. So again, we see that very clearly in the way that funeral support payment actually operates. And just again to go into a wee bit of the background about what that means, because one of the things that I think when we talk about funeral poverty, what we're talking about is poverty. The people who are plunged into crisis because they having to pay for a funeral are most likely, and I think the case studies we've heard already this morning, most likely already struggling on a low income. What the experience of paying for a funeral has done has pushed them further into poverty, and we can see why that's the case. So this chart here shows universal credit as the key part, or its equivalent. So back through history, its equivalents as a percentage of average earnings. So this tells us about what's happened. This is one measure of telling us what's happened to adequacy over time. And what you've seen is really from the 1960s onwards, we've seen a steady decline in the value of universal credit in relation as a proportion of average earnings. It's one way of saying, is this payment keeping up with rising costs and with rising earnings? And we can quite clearly see that it doesn't. And the consequences of that, I think, are quite clear. And I think this is a really important graph here, a little bit complicated. So I won't dwell on it too long, but I think it's really important. This is taken from a recent Joseph Rowntree Foundation report, and it's highlighting the growth of people who are in, as they refer to it, as very deep poverty. So that's 40% below the poverty threshold of median earnings, 60% of median earnings, median income, sorry. And what we can see from the mid-90s is that proportion of people in very deep poverty who are on, that's I think incomes for a single person of less than £100, or the equivalent, has been steadily increasing. So that proportion of people who are already on low incomes, but who are on very low incomes, is increasing. So more and more people who are, if you like, on the edge, who don't have the capacity to deal with an unexpected expense. And very often in the past, when we talked about, or for me anyway, when we talked about unexpected expenses, I often thought about repairs to white goods that you might have at home, or to not be able to a car being off the road and therefore not being able to get to work, that kind of thing. But what we're talking about here is a really significant payment because a loved one has died. plunges people into that very deep poverty. So we're seeing a situation that has, for all that we'd seen some improvements in poverty levels in the early 2000s, we've seen a steady increase in that very deep poverty, and that's something that really gives us cause for concern. Now, I started off by saying there's been no attempt to say what's enough, what's needed. Of course, there has been from outside of government, and something that's really important is the minimum income standard developed by, again, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation and academics at Loughborough University. There's a link there if you want to explore what the minimum income standard is. I'm sure you'll have access to the slides later. But I've picked out that definition of what the minimum income standard is. It's a minimum standard of living that includes more than just food, clothes, and shelter. It's about what you have. It's about having what you need in order to participate in society. And again, I think the experiences that we've heard already speak to that inability to participate in society. The funeral support payment that we have at the current level is not allowing people to participate in the way that they ought to be able to. One final graph from me is this is the minimum income standard for the most recent set of figures, set at £519 for a lone parent with 2 children. And what we can see there is how far an individual in that situation, 2 children, lone parent, falls below that minimum income standard. So the minimum income standard is something that's been well researched. It's what's called a consensual budget. So they ask people, what do you actually need to get by? What is the minimum that you need to get by? And then they make a figure for that based on an accurate costing. And this is the figure that they come up with. And you can see how far, even when someone in this situation, a lone parent, moves into full-time employment on the national living wage, they're still falling almost 25% below what most people would regard as an adequate income. But what this also tells us is that it's possible to identify what an adequate income is. The challenge is for policymakers to use that evidence in the way that they set benefit levels. So from all of this, what are the implications for the Scottish funeral payment? I think as all of the speakers have acknowledged, there's been progress in the way that the system in Scotland has worked, but it doesn't cover the full cost for a funeral for an eligible person, plunges them into can plunge them into real hardship as a result. And there doesn't appear to me, and I don't have the expertise that others on this call have, but there doesn't appear to be a clear rationale for why that is the case. And it's at odds with other parts of the welfare state. We wouldn't expect, in most cases, to use the NHS and pay for large parts of essential care that we need. Why is it that we have to do that with the cost for funerals? And I think the cost of living crisis has undoubtedly made many of these problems worse. So there is an urgent need to act. One of the areas where we are drawing some positivity from is the potential for a minimum income guarantee to be developed in Scotland. This is a long-term solution. This isn't something that we're going to see over the next year or two, but this is a universal minimum income based on that minimum income standard that I just talked about, but it's targeted based on individual needs. So it's not a flat rate like a universal basic income. It would require work to change. It would require it relies on people being able to access goods and fair work, but it's targeted, and it's not simply just universal credit. It's not just a little bit of a higher payment. It's something much more targeted, and I think that's a long-term solution. And I think we need to put some of our discussion about funeral payment into that context. But if we're to draw a line under funeral poverty, I think there are things that we need to do, and I'm sure this is what we'll discuss in the next session, is we need a clearer approach to setting the level of support. Along the lines that Lindesay has outlined, I think would be really positive, but it could be about a proportion of average cost. But I think we need to be looking at how do we cover more, if not all, of the costs. We need to think about eligibility, because we know that take-up is better, but it still has some way to go. And I think as we work on the development of a minimum income guarantee, which Scottish Government has committed to, and organisations like Poverty Alliance and others are on an expert group helping to develop that idea, then we need to make sure that a real assessment of funeral costs is part of the way that we develop that minimum income guarantee. And I think we won't see change unless we campaign, unless we demand it. And I think this summit today is a really good point for building greater momentum behind the need for greater action around funeral poverty. Thanks very much.
One thing I want to stress is that many other people could be involved in this. You know, Lindesay, Peter, myself, we're having these conversations. We're trying to chat to other people. There's some of us who are represented on kind of cross-party group that exists in Scottish Government. Lindesay, I think, engages a similar group UK-wide. There are many different forums that talk about social security in Scotland and committees and things. That there's various people in these places that want to influence. But more importantly, there's people with lived experience, and there's people that work with people who are experiencing funeral poverty on this call and beyond. And we don't want to make it seem like we're trying to take an agenda and run with it. Today is about saying who wants to kind of join in this. Are there other views? What can we do together? Also, just want to come back to saying that, you know, that the context doesn't have to be that Scottish Government's done some heinous sin here and we're all on their backs about it. We understand there's financial pressures. I'm sure almost everyone on this call is like-minded in thinking we kind of want change, not only on this. Of course, we want to see, you know, Peter's rightly saying the big picture. We want to see change across all sorts of benefits and cost of living issues dealt with, like the injustice of decades of change and kind of detachment of what incomes for people who are able to work less or can't work at all or have needs and children. It's become detached from the reality of what costs are over decades, and to lump it all onto the ministers who happen to be in post in Scotland at the moment when they don't control all of the budgets, they don't control all of the history of that, seems a bit rich. And I really do want to make clear that good actions have happened, but that they're just the latest part of a story that's been going on. If that makes sense. Lindesay very nicely showed this kind of graph of funeral director costs and the average cost of funerals completely detaching from where this flat rate is. And for instance, just to put in perspective, we might say that there should be an enormous potential like doubling in what that flat rate should be. That's excellent, and I would thoroughly endorse that, as I'll set out in a second. But, you know, Scottish Government raised it about 9% higher than the UK government, that element. So, you know, that's good steps. Of course, it's in the right direction. It's kind of just saying, is there appetite for more to be done? My summary of where Lindesay's at, which I'm going to paraphrase for my own purposes so you can set it into contrast with what I think a minimum ask might be of Scottish Government, is that if the flat rate, which is currently 1178, was raised to 2330, don't worry about writing this down, everyone. It was raised to 2330. The average payout last year would have been close to 3,100 rather than 1,949. So the average payout for a funeral support payment, including all the different elements, would have been in that kind of order of magnitude. And I'm only saying that so I can kind of say what our kind of pitch might be, and that you can in breakout groups talk about that bit. And then Peter, thank you so much for putting that in part to that wider reform. And we absolutely, for my own self, I really think that stuff around minimum income standards and the minimum income guarantee is really how we can take individual issues like this and try to say this is part of a wider discussion about how this fits and how it fits with the kind of the mission that we set out in legislation that benefits should be doing. It's just something that few governments have the opportunity to review, in the same way that no one wants to touch council tax reform, in the same way saying, well, maybe that benefit should be lower and this one should be higher, can be a third rail for people. So my own kind of perspective on this is just that the heartbreak around all of the stories that Emma, Lindesay talking about, that I'm sure lots of you are there, the idea that this funeral debt falls at a time that even for someone who has plenty of money is literally the hardest time in someone's life for almost everyone. You know, for those of us who escaped specific trauma around war or famine and all these kind of things, bereavement is just something in the human experience which is just awful for people, something we need to try to share in how we can kind of learn to cope and be resilient around it for ourselves. But it is just an awful experience, and to add things on top of that makes a huge difference. There's part of the way we celebrate life and the rituals we have around death that we're in danger of accidentally casting aside because they're kind of nice to have. And an example of that, I think, is how we memorialize people. We all have a lovely time walking around Victorian graveyards. And admittedly, the people we see buried in Victorian graveyards are normally either people who are lucky or wealthy. But the idea that we kind of come to expect that things like memorializing people should be part of our bereavement process. And yet, because it's unaffordable for a majority of people, it's just not part of the discussion. If you've ever tried to get a quote for how much it costs to add one extra letter to a gravestone, it's exorbitant prices. It really shocks you. And for so many people, we end up having a harder time coping with grief and bereavement and rightly celebrating people, not just around bereavement, but because of these kind of factors. And I just find that utterly heartbreaking. The reason I'm particularly interested in this area is I'm absolutely on board with what Peter's saying. Benefits across the board need to raise. But there's some things we can invest in as a society that make a big, big difference. It is about dignity, but it's also about avoiding people getting to spirals of debt and spirals of problem. There's a pivot point in people's life when you're facing poverty, whether it's really deep poverty or you're in so many people in the working poor category now, where fuel costs, housing costs are so high, and yet they're not benefit claimants, but where their whole life can fall into a spiral of debt, the mental health fallout from that, the ability to work, their concept of the world, the way that can change their whole relationship with the state, their friends, their family, can really pivot around a death. In the same way that relationship breakdown is an overlooked part of how people's lives can kind of spiral when you thought you had just about coping, you were managing, and then actually all of the implications of that cause such a massive fallout. Death is being a permanent part of the human experience, but we've got to prevent it being in that space of pivoting. So in terms of a wise investment as a society, this feels like a space where one-off payments can be made, not committing in the same way we do to other agendas to millions of pounds over years for large chunks of society. There's one-off payments for families that are heartbreaking cases that I think when you look at any one example, your heart breaks for them. My interest in saying what are the priorities, we've heard a lot about the sort of specific amount that Scottish Government should pay, and I think that's probably where we might come back to in this. But I don't want you to miss the fact that Emma raised, Lindesay, we might raise as well. There's groups like students that currently really struggle around things like this funeral support payment. There's people who are in poverty but not claiming universal credit, for instance. And I don't just mean the working poor. There's people who choose not to claim it because it's a punishing scheme. And Scottish Government would be the first to say there's people who probably it's reasonable for them to make the choice not to claim universal credit because the awful sanctions and conditionality and the agenda around that they don't sign up to as a government. But where by not claiming it as universal credit, people like students, people not claiming universal credit, unless we can very quickly intervene to give them the information, you need to claim universal credit briefly in order to claim a funeral support payment. Unless we like mobilize as a sector to do that with every case, we're in the risk of a whole bunch of people falling between the cracks. But there's a second bit which we haven't talked about today, which isn't just about the amount of the benefit, that I really want to highlight as well. It doesn't have to be the thing we decide as a priority at all, but there's an area where the people we see at Caledonia Funeral Aid who have a big problem are often people who can't afford the deposit for a funeral director. You need money up front to pay a funeral director. It might be that the average basic funeral cost, sorry, we keep using basic, but the average cost of a funeral in Scotland, which averages out burials and cremations without flowers or wakes or the sandwiches at a wake, for instance, all of those elements, it's just the basic cost the funeral director costs. About £4,030 in Scotland, according to Sunlight's excellent reporting. So if a funeral director said, I only want £1,000 up front, that would be unusual. They might be asking for the whole amount of 4,300 if they think you may be someone who can't pay. They might be asking for half as a kind of typical amount. You would need that cash or a credit card that you could pay that today, or you have to enter a discussion that says, well, I'm thinking about claiming the funeral benefit. And if that funeral director is thinking this funeral is going to cost a total of about £4,000, including maybe half of that representing their fees, and they know that the average payout is only going to be about 2,000, they're rightly going into that bit skeptical. How are you going to raise the money for this? I don't want a debt, the funeral director might say. These are often well-meaning funeral directors who are making the necessary commercial decision that they see in front of them. How do I judge an amount of deposit? And if someone can't come up with the money, then they might not be given a funeral date. They might refuse to collect the deceased. They might have collected the deceased and have them in a mortuary. And then when the person says, I can't afford to have this funeral with you, the funeral director charges them for the removal to another funeral director that's more affordable. So there's a problem around deposits. And specifically, we're hearing more stories, and they are anecdotal, and I don't have statistics for this, but more stories. And for some reason, they've mostly been in Edinburgh at the minute, but we think it's probably a wider problem. But funeral directors are basically saying the easiest thing for us is just to avoid working with people on benefits. We know we get into trouble with deposits. We know we have unpaid bills. We know the funeral support payment doesn't cover it enough. We know that also the liaison with the funeral support stuff has some issues where we can't be told whether or not someone's entitled, has put in a claim yet. So we don't know for certain that the person who's told us they put in a funeral support payment claim has used our name as the funeral director to say that they're doing a funeral. And because of that, funeral directors are increasingly saying, I refuse to work with people on benefits. Now, we don't want to lay all the blame for this at Scottish Government store either. There's more going on in this equation, but there's something about saying, what are the levers we can pull with the funeral support payment that means that the amount can be higher, that might induce funeral directors to have more sympathy for people on benefits, and make it so it's clearer to funeral directors that there's a funeral support payment being made that's kind of equivalent to them having put a deposit down. I'm not pushing all funeral directors into the bus. So many are excellent in both their service and their ethos and their values. But when this has become a story we hear quite often from people who get in touch with Caledonia Funeral Aid, we need to respond in some way. And we can try to respond on an individual basis. And we sometimes know the funeral directors that we can contact that have a bit more leniency, but this is a key issue. But I'm going to move away from that and just summarize where I think, and there's 40 odd people on this call, and there'll be 40 odd different perspectives. I completely agree with what Lindesay is saying. My aspiration would be that the amount of an average funeral support payment was closer to 3,100 last year to reflect the kind of amount, and that we tack the funeral director's average fees to the flat rate. That would be an excellent way of doing it, and identifying a UK authority on that number, in addition to Sun Life's fantastic research, is a useful way of doing that, and I completely agree with that. The idea that the amount would be tethered to something tangible, about how it changes, means that in 20 years, we don't need to worry about it becoming detached from reality again. So I do completely agree with that. I'm conscious that I have a low ask, which would be my suggestion of a minimum ask of government at this stage. I don't want to dilute. There's nothing worse than already having compromised or something. But I think we should be asking Scottish Government to commit to aspiring to something higher, even if it takes them a long time to get there. And I think Lindsay's picking out the right kind of peg that they could aspire towards. There's no harm in them aspiring and then saying that Westminster haven't given them enough money. It's absolutely fine. But at the minute, I feel like aspiration isn't there for it to increase radically like that to a rate that would actually prevent these spirals of poverty for more people. My own suggestion is that we kind of link it to a different bit of thinking, which is around how you define relative poverty. So in terms of income, the widest definition of poverty will be that you're on 60% of a minimum income. Relative poverty means that you're tacking how you define poverty to something that's increasing over time. So rather than say, we've come up with an amount that we think is where people fall into poverty, and then we relate it to something like the CPI index, which again, we know that works fine for a few years, but it becomes detached from reality. So my suggestion is we kind of turn that on its head and say the absolute minimum is that the average payout for funeral support payment should be tacked to approximately 60% of the average funeral. So if the average funeral in Scotland was 4,000, at the minute it's less than 50% is covered on average by a payout. And my suggestion would be it was done retrospective every year to say, how can we make sure that we're reflecting the flat rate that would kind of show that the average was going to better achieve 60%. It's a funny way of saying it, but it would mean that the average went up from lower than 2,000 to 2,418 just now. And it would just be a way of checking in of government being like, have we accidentally become detached from the reality of how expensive funerals are getting by using the CPI index to uplift it every year? So it might be that some years they looked at that and they said, actually, we're doing fine. We don't need to make a change. And other years they say, oh my God, there's been a significant uplift in funeral costs this year. We need to make sure by next year we're responding to that. So there's a sort of somewhere in between option, in my opinion, there. And I'm partly just reflecting that I'm keen to ask government something that they can respond to and have an aspiration of growth, but also potentially something where we can meet them in the middle. I'm going to put in the chat a link to a Mentimeter. Someone shout at me if it's the wrong link or there's something completely wrong about it, by the way. And then I'll share my screen in a second. So in order to feed back a little bit about what you're talking about, I've got two Mentimeter questions that if you can't follow the link, again, just put that and I can share it in a different way. And then what I'm going to do with that, sorry, is share my screen in 1 second so you can see a little bit about the what people are writing in that, if that's all right. And then the first question is, can you rank what you think about what our priorities could be based on this description? Apologies, I had to write this before I was able to obviously have today's conversation. And I'll show you the things as they come in. Maybe is that a little bit biasing the results? Let me share my screen a little bit so you can see what people are writing in a second. So, and then the second question is an open question and says, what do you think is the other key issues? And I'll come to that in 1 second. So, you know, do we think it's about what do we think priorities? And then I'll move to the second question in just a second. Broadly, I think it's fair to say people are seeing that there's there's multiple issues going on here. These seem there's this kind of debate about whether it's about how much it is for the existing people or making it broader. I think there's this question of, can we ask for more breadth to the payout as well as more scale to each payout? At the same time, it's a difficult one, isn't it? And then if you're still in the presentation there, if you could make an open, it'll now ask you for an open text question, or you might need to move on and submit if you haven't on the first page, to say in your own words, what action should we be asking of government? So don't feel you can't repeat yourself based on the previous thing. It could be like, you know, we ask government to raise their aspirations, even if they can't raise the amount. We ask them to make sure they include this group that's overlooked. We ask them to I wanted to make sure that even if you really think that the fundamental thing is one of the more obvious bits, like increase the amount we're paying out, how would you say it in your own words so we can kind of make sure we're not missing some opportunity, or we're not kind of mischaracterizing things. And then I'll just show you some of the results that people have already written, but I can see people are choosing to write more. But these are some of the things that people have already managed to type out and click send. If you just want to see what your colleagues are thinking about. I can see there's a whole range of things, including how it's publicized, that it's more linked to actual funeral costs as an amount that we pay. More regulation of the funeral industry is something interesting. Someone's writing in as well. I've always been of the view that regulation in the funeral industry might significantly increase costs, but actually the Sun Life report said potentially the opposite is true. So excellent, you know, excellent to hear that I'm wrong. If you're something, that's always good to hear. Excellent. So can I come to one of Lindsay or Peter to just say, have you any suggestion for maybe some campaigning action we could take forward just now? You don't have to be right. I just want to put it in the ether. And then what we'll do is send around the recording of this to people who attended. We'll send out what we heard from people alongside any suggestions for what we do next. And if you want to collaborate on those actions or have other suggestions for actions, do get in touch with us. So Peter, do you want to go first? You just happen to be on my screen and Lindsay isn't.
Sure, John, happy to go first. And firstly, just before I do, thanks again for everyone's contributions today. I think it's been a really important discussion, and one that certainly the Poverty Alliance will commit to working with others here to take forward actions. I think in terms of what we, Poverty Alliance as a network, can do, or one of our campaigns is on this call as well, we'll certainly be looking at how we integrate this into ongoing work. So particularly around our work around the minimum income guarantee, we're involved in discussions about how that will shape up over the next few years. And I think getting this issue into that forum is really important. And through our general engagements with politicians, we'll make sure that we increasingly raise the issue. But I do think John, Lindsay, others will have more expertise about the timing for this. But I think a concerted approach to Scottish Government, with the backing of a broad part of civil society, third sector organisations, faith-based organisations, others, to highlight this and to show the strength of concern around this issue would be really important. For that, I think we do need to bottom out what those key demands are, whether it's around eligibility or level, and exactly what level, whether it's interim steps. And I think that's work that we need to do. But I think going to Scottish Government with that kind of demand is really important, with the backing of parts of the sector.
Thanks. And Lindsay, I'm going to give you a sort of final word and then I'll just close the session afterwards. But have you any suggestions?
I mean, I think I would just, it's been really heartening to see so many people here today, and picking up on what Peter was just saying and comments in the chat as well, that civil society organisations really need to work together to make change in government. This is seen more and more currently in various kind of studies and experience. So I think building on what we have today, and I guess calling on people to engage further with us and with each other around trying to find a common ask, and putting that to government as a broad alliance, I think would be a good way forward. Thanks
so much. Okay, thank you. I think one way forward is please get in touch afterwards. We'll share the information here. You might want to reflect back on it. I think what I might do is have a discussion with Lindesay and Peter, and anyone else who feels like their organisation wants to weigh in on this, please just get in touch and maybe put out what could be the meat of either a presentation or a letter or something like that, that would say, we actually think this might be the position. And then we'll send what we come up with around to all the people who came to this meeting and in our networks to say, are people happy with whether we're coming up with some sort of kind of consensus position? See if we can kind of adjust it a little bit. And then later in the year, because I really don't think it's about lobbying people tomorrow, it's about gathering pace for later in the year when there might be an opportunity. We could then present that either to a cross-party group, to a social security group, to ministers, or as a letter. So I think we'll just see if we can put a few paragraphs together, and anyone who wants to get involved with that in addition to us, you're very, very welcome to do so. Thank you so much for your time. I hope that was useful. Thank you to our speakers, very much appreciated. And thank you again to Catherine for organizing things. So thank you.